Nothing feels better than accomplishing something. That's a pretty broad statement, but giving yourself a task and completing it, even if the task was as simple as do the dishes, can feel extremely rewarding. The feeling is obviously much stronger if you had to overcome a great obstacle, and I think most people have faced some sort of adversity, a mountain to climb. While it doesn't automatically make a story good or well written, relatability can greatly enhance the effect of a story's message. If you're playing as or watching someone go through something that you felt like you did or are currently doing, it helps you become more engrossed. But no matter what the task is, small or large, you always start at the bottom looking up. I can't think of another 2D platformer that had much of a story, but that's to be expected. It's not a genre that often lends itself to a story. And to be fair, Celeste doesn't exactly have the complexity of a Kojima title. But perhaps part of the reason the story is so effective is because of how simple it is, and it never gets in the way. In other words, the story is only as important as you want it to be, and the game's flow isn't negatively affected. But if you care to look, Celeste wears its heart on its sleeve. It tells the story of a young woman, Madeline, who's stuck in a rut and is attempting to climb Celeste Mountain. Slightly deeper than that, it's a story about facing your inner demons. That heart refers to the game's message about depression and anxiety, two things Madeline struggles with. The mountain serves as a physical representation of her emotional issues, and reaching the summit is as much a mental victory as it is corporeal. If she can overcome the mountain, she can overcome anything, even herself. The mountain packs a punch, though, beyond its topography. An old woman before the base of the mountain tells Madeline that there are things that she's not ready to see, that the mountain is a strange place. Madeline finds an example of this when she encounters a mirrored version of herself, referred to as Badeline by the game's community. Badeline is the manifestation of everything wrong in Madeline's mind, that depression and anxiety, and every other negative thought. Something magical within the mountain has brought her to life, and she appears periodically to stop Madeline from making the climb. She's not alone in the mountain, though. Within the ruins of an abandoned city, Madeline meets Theo, a budding photographer interested in the old sites of Celeste. The two share an introductory conversation before splitting off on their own ways. Another face belongs to Mr. Oshiro, the owner and concierge of a once functional hotel on the mountain. This is where you're able to see the mountain's magic affect someone else. Oshiro is clearly still attached to his hotel, which you can gather by reading various notes and journal entries throughout. The hotel itself is run down and covered by dust bunnies, another community-dubbed nickname. Madeline helps clean up some of the hotel after her desire to leave is defeated by her willingness to help others. Oshiro is a proud man, though. He seems to reject the truth about his hotel, but deep down he realizes it and feels a powerful shame and regret. Between that and Badeline showing up to insult both Madeline and Oshiro, he loses control. The dust bunnies seem to have stemmed from his own negative thoughts, just like Badeline from our main character, and he lashes out, chasing Madeline out of the hotel. There are two things to keep in mind that I'll come back to. The dust bunnies and Badeline's assertion that she says things that Madeline wants to but isn't strong enough to, that she needs her. Next up, Madeline encounters the old woman again. She had mocked Madeline once before and continued to do so now. After Madeline insists that the mountain drove both her and Oshiro crazy, she replies that the mountain doesn't bring out anything that isn't already in you. Celeste isn't creating its own monsters to hurt people, rather it draws from the inhabitants' minds. Further proof of this is shown once more when Theo and Madeline meet up again. Halfway across a chasm in a cable car, it reaches a halt and Madeline begins to have a panic attack, once again caused by her other self. Theo teaches her a breathing exercise, which calms her down. Even though it's Celeste that brings Badeline out physically, it's a mental exercise that's able to make her go away, at least for now. After it begins to move again, Theo and Madeline reach the Mirror Temple, a mystical place that seems to thrust the two of them into some sort of mirrored dimension, filled with more manifestations of Madeline's inner self. After the two separate, Madeline finds Theo trapped in a crystal shield. She's forced to carry him through the remainder of the temple before she comes across a giant pulsating eye. They destroy it and escape the temple, and seemingly the mirrored world. Of course, when Theo and Madeline share a long conversation afterward, their own speculation about Celeste bringing these things to life breaks any need of our own speculation. So rather than me explaining the story itself, it's more how the story's themes are expressed and why I think it's interesting. That breathing trick Theo taught Madeline, which was imagining a feather floating up and down with your breathing, takes physical form and helps Madeline continue through the mountain. Unfortunately, as she climbs farther, Badeline appears once more and rejects Madeline's attempt to set her free. She tries the breathing exercise again, but this time it doesn't work, and she's sent plummeting to the bottom of the mountain. Sometimes it feels like I'm reaching for real-life connections where there might not be one, but I think that's part of the fun with stories like this. The speculated message here is that there isn't always a simple answer, like the feather exercise. Sometimes it's a lot bigger than that. You could argue that this is still a work of fiction, not everything needs a real-life message. That's true, but in the case of this game, it's pretty easy to bridge the ideas, especially considering the game's themes do heavily revolve around very real things. After the fall, Madeline runs into the old woman for a third time. This time, she's not as unkind. She recommends talking to her reflection to see why she's so scared. Reasonable advice for someone who at most times seems antagonistic. In any case, she takes the old woman's advice and Madeline confronts herself. During the confrontation, they talk about needing each other to be whole, and the ordeal climaxes in a fantastic sequence. Madeline talks about fear, but after being comforted, the two of them merge and Madeline comes out stronger than before. If I have to make a link to the real world, I guess the message would be that you need to accept your shortcomings, that if you can, then you'll be stronger. Again, not everything needs to be tied back to real life, and of course no one thing works for everyone, but at least for the sake of this game, I think this is a great part of the story. Everything comes together cohesively, and my emotional connection here was a lot larger than I ever thought would come from this game. They reunite with Theo and the old woman, who are both very supportive. Only one thing was left: reach the summit. There are a lot of ways to make a good character, but there are two important aspects that come to mind. The first is being predictable. To clarify, there's predictable writing and then there's predictable characters. Predictable writing is typically a bad thing to me. Being able to see the outcome coming from a million miles away without any actual close look at the story. Predictable characters, at least the way I'm defining them, you're able to understand such that you can make a presumption about their behavior or words based on past instances, which is often helped by the second important thing, well-defined traits. Separating Madeline from her negative counterpart gives you a good look at her as a full character if you consider them one and the same. Although Madeline represents her depression, she also displays Madeline's less desirable traits. She's a bit short-tempered, and if the things she says has any connection to how Madeline speaks outside of the mountain, Madeline might say some harsh things to people that she doesn't really mean. But you also see that Madeline is shy, as she took some time to warm up to Theo. She's headstrong, as despite always getting in her own way, her determination helped her reach the summit. And she's compassionate when she wants to hear Theo talk about his sister and grandfather and helps Oshiro clean his resort despite her reluctance. It does help that there are only 4 characters in the game, but Oshiro and the old woman have their own strong personality and they feel like more than just a single dimension. There are several times where Madeline and Theo have long conversations. Through this, you're able to derive a good deal of the history of Celeste, like the temple predating everything else. We also learn about them. Theo has a sister named Alex, who he compares a lot to Madeline. He even calls her Alex once accidentally. In fact, both their names are written in red text every time they're said in the game, though I can't really find a reason as to why. I know he compares the two a lot, but the game is consistent in color-coding names. Maybe it was just to show further that the two are very similar so we can get a better idea of Alex, unless they're the same person. But really, we can also use this to get a good idea of Theo as a character. He's a kind, thoughtful person who gained his passion for photography through his grandfather who had told him once about Celeste. Unlike Madeline though, he has no interest in reaching the summit, just to see the old sights of the mountain. He's a wacky, eccentric guy, but also patient and understanding. Though he does seem to have some negativity in him too. He refers to the crystal prison as an expression of my negative psychic energy or whatever. During one of their conversations, Theo tells Madeline that he feels trapped in his dead-end job, which is likely where being trapped in the crystal comes from. It's interesting though because we see that even someone who's generally positive can still harbor negative thoughts and be affected by the mountain. Oshiro is like that to a greater extent. He seems to be genuine in his desire to give Madeline a good experience in his resort. He's not malicious, but his time on the mountain has certainly warped his mind. Before you see him, you only see Celeste's effect on Madeline. There's a weird sense of comfort you get when you see it act on him too though, knowing you're not alone. We can see this through the dust bunnies. Every time Oshiro loses his cool, the dust bunnies emerge from him. The disastrous state of the resort and its creepy inhabitants are because of him and what Celeste is doing to him. Unfortunately, unlike Madeline, he's lost his battle. But we do get a window into his past. He clearly loves his resort, you can see that based on what he whispers to himself. But there are 2 pieces of information that can be gathered in the resort. When you start cleaning up for him, you may stumble upon a piece of paper, a notice to the resort staff from Oshiro reluctantly discussing the resort's upcoming closure. Later you can find a diary entry he wrote the day they closed, decades prior to now. The rest of the staff went for a hike to the summit together. Oshiro, wanting to look around one last time, told them to go on and that he'd catch up. His words seemed distraught, as though he was losing his sense of purpose and he never ended up leaving. So he stayed, eventually losing his sanity, convinced that the resort was still open for business. Between his persistence to give Madeline the stay of her life and the sincerity in his letters, you can't help but feel bad that the thing he lost was what he loved the most and succumbed to his humiliation and to the mountain. I'm not entirely sure what this game's fixation on mirrors is for. Madeline's first encounter is after shattering a mirror, and a second time in Oshiro's presidential suite. I suppose it would mean that their negative thoughts exist in a mirrored world, and the temple acts as a bridge between the two, and where Celeste draws its magic. Madeline does mention that the temple amplifies Celeste's power, and it is called the Mirror Temple, so maybe I do understand what the fixation is. I wonder though, when Celeste began affecting people. The first chapter takes place in an abandoned city, but one that has a significant amount of progress that apparently no one wanted to live in. Given that Oshiro's resort went out of business decades ago, I'm willing to bet that that was around the same time the city stopped construction. My assumption is that this was when the mountain came to life, so to speak. Theo mentions the city being a government cover-up. I'm not sure, but that could mean the corporation building the city knew something about the mountain, and maybe that's what woke it up, driving everyone who lived on the mountain away. Everyone except for Oshiro and the old woman. Oshiro has lost it, that we can see, but if everyone on Celeste left, died, or went insane, why is the old woman relatively unaffected? Well, maybe she was. For one, she tells Madeline that she reminds her of herself when she was young. In the epilogue, she tells Oshiro that it's the first time she's ever seen him outside of the resort. This could mean that she's been to the resort post-closure too, since Oshiro roams the grounds, but I think it means that she's been on the mountain for at least the decades since the resort's shutdown. But the most interesting thing about her is that every single time you see her, you see the blue crow, the same crow that imbues you with the ability to dash. You could say that it was just a tutorial for controls, but since you can't dash prior, I'm gonna go with that. Nevertheless, the crow is always there. The dash, after leaving the resort, at the bottom of the mountain when you fall, the cabin in the epilogue, in the mountain's core, after the end of the game. What I think is that the old woman, when she was younger, came to Celeste for a similar reason to Madeline. She battles her inner self the same way Madeline does, and becomes stronger for it when she eventually confronts it. To me, this means the crow is either the result of her beating herself and they somehow became one and the same like Madeline and Madeline, or they just paired. Keep in mind that crow can be used as a derogatory term for an old woman. She subsequently decides to stay on the mountain, having proven that she could beat it. This is why she's able to traverse the mountain so much more quickly than Madeline, and it's her way of watching over her. There are pieces here that make the puzzle. She's been on the mountain a long time, she warns of strange things, so she's obviously familiar with the mountain's tricks. Madeline isn't the first to say she's gone crazy. You'd have to be a few crows short of a murder to live up here, literally speaking about her crow, and she knows about Celeste's core. Oshiro even mentions a birdie telling him about the party, so whether the crow and the old woman are one and the same or not, I think it's fair to surmise that she went through a similar experience to Madeline, which is why she may be eccentric but not really the degree of crazy that Oshiro is. Her coldness to Madeline in the first two encounters may have been to give her a push, someone other than herself to defy. Perhaps because if someone can't handle what the woman had to say, they certainly couldn't handle the mountain. After all, she would know. She's beaten Celeste and continues to live there as its seemingly only conqueror. Until now. The story closes with a heartwarming engagement in the old woman's cabin. All of our characters gather, no longer filled with animosity, and Madeline can finally enjoy the fruits of her labor. It's safe to say that depression doesn't rear its ugly head the same way for everyone. It can be hard to explain, and there are a lot of people that struggle to understand what someone is going through. It's like I'm at the bottom of an ocean. I can't see anything in any direction. It's claustrophobic, yet I feel exposed. That's how Madeline describes hers. It sounds contradictory, but that seems to be how depression works. Madeline tells Madeline that she's doing her a favor by saying the things that she says for her. Depression is full of these conflicting views about yourself, and I think the relationship between those two sides is demonstrated very well with Madeline and her other self. She also mentions her head getting fixated on things that happened a long time ago, stuff that she should have gotten over by now but can't. Another good example is in the second chapter. Madeline has a phone call with her mother. Her mother's comments are disparaging and dismissive. Of course, it turns out Madeline is dreaming. When she awakes, she does have an actual phone call with her mom, but this time her mother is supportive and concerned for her. This isn't exclusive to people with depression, though perhaps worse, but it exemplifies a habit of convincing yourself that people think the worst, that no one cares. This sequence hopes to show that it's not always true, that someone does care. In fact, in her deepest conversation with Theo, she says she doesn't really talk about her depression to anyone, only her mom really knows. She tells Theo it feels good to say it out loud, and that's important. Having someone to talk to can make a world of difference. It's as the old woman says, Celeste Mountain is a place of healing. The first step of healing is confronting the problem. The solution to all of this in the game seems a bit expedient, but it is a video game more than it is anything else, and to be fair, the message seems to show the importance of introspection, and I think that's a valuable idea. To love yourself. Identity is key. If it's a game with clear-cut levels, a strong diversity to them is important. This was something I talked about in my Sonic Mania video. If a game is using a lot of the same ideas throughout, a distinct visual identity keeps it from feeling stale. But in Mania, a game based on getting through levels very quickly, there isn't really time to stop and smell the roses, so the similarities between levels aren't as noticeable, theoretically. Celeste is different. Identity is even more important. You're going to die. A lot. I had a little over 1,000 deaths after completing the game for the first time, and I think that was on the relatively low end. This means replaying parts several times. While visual identity between levels is vital, a game like this needs gameplay variety more so because each chapter is comprised of so many different rooms. Without this, the game gets boring. Celeste is able to achieve this in two different ways: mechanics and fundamentals. Mechanics refer to player controls as well as various level features. Fundamentals refer to the core gameplay experience. I know it probably sounds a bit pedantic as they may bleed into each other a bit, but essentially, mechanics are how you impact the game, fundamentals are how the game impacts you. Firstly, there are player mechanics, which in Celeste is simply dashing, jumping, and climbing. Dashing recharges when you land on anything tangible, enter a new room, or collect a gem. The same goes for climbing, which has limited stamina. This is the basic idea, but there's more to that later. Then there are level mechanics, the aspects in each of the 8 chapters the player interacts with. Most of these are chapter specific, but there are some that appear multiple times throughout the game. Before I get into specifics, I have to mention the most important fundamental in the game: momentum. Every time something causes you to move, be it a dash or a moving platform, it will enact a force on you that temporarily lingers after movement has stopped. In the Forsaken City, the main mechanic is a stoplight, a platform that moves quickly along a track when you grab or land on it before slowly retracting. The first time you come across one of these, you likely don't know about the momentum yet. There are spikes to the right and a tunnel leading up. Naturally, your instinct will be to jump once the platform moves you, but because the momentum lingers, there's a good chance you'll jump too soon and be launched into the spikes. If not, there are more opportunities to discover this before you reach a point of the chapter where using that momentum is required. This concept is something I discussed in my Sonic Mania video too. The best type of tutorial doesn't let you know it's a tutorial. With simple presentation, you can allow players to organically learn about the game's mechanics. There's no need for text to appear to tell you to jump onto the stoplight. It's your only option. You'll find that it moves all on your own. The same goes for momentum. The only exception would be specific button controls, but this kind of thing is found throughout the whole game. Lowering platforms, dust bunnies, bubbles, controllable platforms, clouds, feathers, platforms that move when you dash, etc. These all have an introduction wherein your only option is to jump onto them. It's clear there's something you can jump onto, but their behavior is unclear until you first land. The platforms that match your dash in the Mirror Temple are particularly noteworthy. The first room that contains them doesn't have much else. There are several of them placed sporadically and an exit on the right. In order to reach one of the higher ones, as you may try since this is the 5th chapter and you're familiar with the game, you have to dash. As soon as you do that, you'll see all of them move along their respective track. The reason this room did stand out to me compared to other mechanics was simply because no other level sticks you in a room with a significant amount of them at one time, and at a cursory glance, they don't do anything special, until you discover it. I mentioned that your dash recharges when you land on something tangible. I said that instead of just landing on solid ground because there are various mechanics that you bounce off instead of landing. In the Celestial Resort, and actually I just realized where the word Celeste comes from now, you have a boss fight of sorts against Oshiro where you can recharge by jumping off his head. In the Golden Ridge, there are snowballs fired at you that work similarly. In the Mirror Temple, the monsters that chase you and Theo can also be bounced on, and I'm sure you get the point. For the sake of brevity, I won't go into every single level, much as I'd like to. As I said, fundamentals are the way the game impacts you. The first chapter acts as a sort of control. It functions as you would expect. The most notable of fundamentals comes from Golden Ridge and unique sections of Summit. In the former, a strong wind blows either left or right, making it harder or easier to move respectively. In the latter, wind blows either up or down, making it harder or easier to jump respectively. While your dash travels the same distance, required timing shifts and makes for a different game feel. The old site is a lot more subtle. For the second half of this chapter, a number of battle line copies mirror you. While your actual movement isn't physically affected, you are required to move more quickly and consistently, which gives you less time to plan out your decisions. The resort's change has a similar nuance. There are a lot of walls and floors covered in worm-like things. After making contact with them and moving away, they'll bloom into dust bunnies. This could mean taking some extra time to plan out a jump before making it, otherwise you might misjudge and have to come and touch back down on the hazard that you created. I admit that this one is a bit more minor of a fundamental change than others I've mentioned. Mind you, I mentioned these last two being nuanced or subtle because I don't think many players would look at these level features and consider how it changes how they play. Not that it really matters, but for some reason I'm kind of obsessed with that stuff. The Mirror Temple is a bit more in your face about it. When you're carrying Theo and his crystal in the last section of this chapter, you're not able to dash. Instead, you have to throw him before you can dash. With the monsters dashing at you as well, this section feels significantly changed from something like the Forsaken City. I'd also like to add that this makes for some fun challenges. Reflections is arguably a mechanic as much as it is a fundamental, but I mentioned that there is some bleed between the categories. The feathers briefly allow you to fly, and also change your directional control from 8 directions to a full 360 degrees. While it's more you interacting with the game rather than the other way around, the way it plays is significantly different enough that I'd argue it's a fundamental change as well. Again, considering these are categories I discerned on my own, I'm allowed to do that. The core is the 8th chapter, one that doesn't appear until you've beaten Summit and finished the epilogue. There are a few things about this chapter that make it so cool and different from others, and this includes mechanics and fundamentals. To start, you do not recharge your dash when landing on something, but only when you enter a new room. This results in a large change in level design. That's combined with the dueling ice and fire themes this chapter swaps between, which alters how each of the mechanics behave. The moving walls turn into a slippery one, fireballs turn into bounceable ice balls, and a stationary fireball becomes a bumper. Lastly, later in the level, the rooms have ice and lava sandwiching you, forcing you to move more quickly. The core is easily the most diverse chapter in terms of what it throws at you. You could argue that for Summit, but that's because it uses reprises from each prior chapter, so that's not really the same. As I said at the start, the strength in diversity is that it keeps a game from feeling stale as you progress through it. These mechanics and fundamentals achieve that in marriage with the strong visual identity, and Celeste almost feels like 8 slightly different games than a single one, which I think was great. Mind you, while the game has its hard moments in these chapters, the true challenge and fun hasn't even begun. Celeste's exploration functions on 2 important questions. Can I make it to that ledge, and can I climb that wall? There are 3 types of collectibles, the most common being strawberries, 175 of which can be found in every chapter excluding the 6th. While a lot of the strawberries require more difficult rooms than that of the main path, they are more about exploring the chapters and discovering their secrets, and there are a lot of them. Hidden paths behind breakable or intangible walls litter the game to the point where I would die time after time trying to find out if I could break through a wall that looked slightly off. While the various challenges do show an impressive understanding of level design, the most impressive result of the level design is how they were able to cleverly hide so many secrets without tiring out the same tricks. The consistency at which they hid them well was satisfying, and that's key. It should feel good to find a secret, like you thought you beat them at their own game, while also not feeling like the ones you didn't find were unfairly hidden. Technically speaking, the strawberries don't serve a functional purpose. They support the exploration. Exploring everything you can might be fun in general, but I think a lot of people are going to skip that aspect if there isn't anything to be found going that way. Likewise, no one is going to enjoy collecting strawberries if there's no search required. It's a treasure hunt. The berries themselves are proof that you either achieved a difficult task or found a well-hidden secret. The devs are recognizing you for reaching an area and providing you with something to let you know. I certainly won't go through every single one. I can't imagine making a video detailing every single collectible when there's over 100, right? If you are interested in seeing any, I would suggest purchasing the game, or more easily, just watch the background footage. Can I make it to that ledge? That simple question will drive you to figure out where every single hidden path is keeping you away. But those paths aren't just hiding strawberries. The core doesn't actually unlock just for beating the epilogue. When you try to enter the cave, you'll be stopped by a large wall with 4 hearts on it. Until you collect 4, you're not coming in. This requirement is kind of strange to me, but it's there nonetheless. Thinking back, an average player would have only come across a heart a single time in the game, assuming said player would even remember having done so. In the resort, after cleaning up for Oshiro, a hallway takes you by an unreachable blue crystal heart. There are one of these in every chapter. These require a fair amount of exploration, and some need even more than that, though not all of them are perfect. There's a room in the Forsaken City with a satellite and a computer that blink through a series of colors. To the left, 5 birds matching those colors that periodically conglomerate before dashing off in their own direction. The answer is to dash the direction that each bird does corresponding to the order the colors appear on the screen. To me, this is a reasonable puzzle. I don't think the information provided is too cryptic or lacking. However, because Celeste doesn't really feature puzzles at all, I think it's unlikely many players will even realize they have to do something here, and that's the main issue I have here. That said, if you do, then you'll put in the pattern and the heart will appear. Dash into it and it's yours. In the old fort near the end of the level, there are a number of platforms you can climb up to that go pretty high. When you reach the top, a heart is trapped inside a room you can't enter, but to the right there's a poem that reads, "An apparition, not of this world, but because of it, lurking out of frame. Awake, my heart is a fortress, in dreams I am vulnerable." To explain quickly, this chapter has two portions, one in a dream, one awake. This poem is seen while awake, where the heart is in a fortress. In other words, inside the walls. If whoever wrote this is vulnerable in dreams, then it would mean to climb in the fort in the dream section. That's not all you have to figure out though. I mentioned that your dash resets when you enter a new room, and seemingly that's only really important in chapter 8, but that's not quite true. This came in handy when I thought of my question, can I climb that wall? With that in mind, the very first room in this chapter, you can reach the wall above if you climb by dashing back and forth between rooms until you reach the wall itself. Continue to do so and you'll eventually reach the heart. Now, admittedly, I had realized this was a possibility before I ever found the poem, so I'm not actually sure how effective it is as a hint. I'd be interested if anyone could tell me if they had found the poem first and it helped them figure it out. Even still, I think this was a really satisfying heart after getting it. I absolutely did not expect it to lead to anything, but since Celeste conditioned me to investigate everything I felt was suspicious, it was a great payoff. In the resort, the coolest part of when you help Oshiro clean is when you choose which of the 3 paths you do first. Depending on which you do first, the next 2 paths will be slightly varied. If you do the towel path, there's a hidden room blocked off by towels. Since you can't re-enter a path once it's clean, you have to use a secret tunnel that leads back the way you came, and now you can enter that room. Going through will lead you to what was probably the first heart you saw. This heart is cool because it's the only one that lets you know where it is without searching. The way to actually reach it requires a bit of searching and some thinking, but giving you the position lets you map out the area mentally and figure out your way to it. You just need to be aware that you're cleaning up the thing that was blocking you to begin with, and since your entrance to the final room closes when you enter, the only solution is a hidden path leading from here. Golden Ridge's heart is a nifty reference to Super Mario Bros. 3. I suppose the issue here is that if you aren't familiar with the reference, this may take a while. There is a small hint though that you can go behind the white block if walking along the ground. Like Old Fort's poem, however, I'm not entirely sure how helpful this is. Either way, I think this is a cool nod to what is likely a large inspiration to Celeste. The heart in the Mirror Temple is probably the easiest one, it only needs a little bit of thought. You have a key and there's a door to go through. You'll also notice there's a red bubble to go back over the chasm you came from. I can't think of another room in Celeste that gives you a way to go back over a gap like this other than just killing yourself to go back, so if you have any amount of suspicion, you'll investigate this bubble. Couple that with the locked door farther in the level and no key to be found other than this one, it might not take you long to stumble across this hidden path. The room itself is simple enough, but finding it is the fun part. If there was any way to realize that Celeste has any puzzles at all, it's probably because of reflection. After the sufficient amount of exploration brings you to this room, you'll probably recognize the same colors that are on the birds in the Forsaken City. This is what prompted my return to that room because I actually had no idea there was something to do originally. The challenge here is to recognize the arrow sculptures. The first has to put the same pattern in, then again with the left and right swapped, then with the up and down swapped. The last torch's sculpture is destroyed, but the last possible thing to do would be to swap all 4 directions in that pattern. Do this and you've got your heart. Summits is a simple one. This chapter has 7 distinct sections, 1 reprise for each chapter, and then a section of its own design. In this one you'll find a hidden room with a heart blocked off by spikes and 6 gem-shaped cutouts in the ground. All you have to do is explore each section and find the gems. While these have some neat challenges, there's nothing particularly of note. The same can be said for the core now that you're able to enter. At the end of the level, you enter some weird sort of black void. Traverse through it and the heart's waiting for you. Right before you collect that last blue crystal heart, you collect something else. During your search for the strawberries and blue hearts, there's a good chance you came across at least one B-side tape, if not the cores. If you thought the base game had enough content as it was, here's where it starts to get amazing. Each of these tapes unlocks a B-side for the chapter, a more difficult version. While they're shorter and don't have any strawberries or additional paths, they act as a greater challenge for players looking for one. Beating all of the B-sides will result in collecting a red crystal heart. You'll find that necessary as, just like the A-side, you need to collect every blue and red heart in order to do the core's B-side. What's strange here is to do the B-side you need all 15 available hearts, but to do the A-side you only need 4. You'd think the requirement would be 7 blue hearts. There are 2 reasons I believe this isn't the case. For one, you can actually do the B-sides as soon as you collect the tape for any chapter, so you could reach the core's A-side while already having 14 hearts. Second, the requirement for any hearts at all might be to tell the player that these exist as a collectible provided they ignore the one in the resort. In any case, beating all 8 B-sides will give you 8 blue and 8 red crystal hearts. If you thought that was enough content, then you'll be even more surprised. After getting all 16, the C-sides are automatically unlocked for every level. They continue the trend of shortening the level but increasing the difficulty. They mostly follow a trend of a couple difficult rooms followed by one particularly long gauntlet. Beating one of these results in a yellow crystal heart to add to your collection. There are several reasons I adore these additional levels. Anytime a game gives me a set of abilities, my greatest desire is to use those to their extent. It's certainly fun to use them yourself in ways that didn't require them, but that isn't enough for me. That was my main complaint with Super Mario Odyssey. It has some of the most satisfying controls in a game I've ever played, and while they can allow you to create your own challenges to diverse levels, the game never has a portion where you're required to do so. It's like having exploration in a level, but there's nothing at the end of it. Maybe I'm just too obsessed with getting a ribbon for completing something. Nevertheless, this is what I like about the B and C sides. They don't necessarily require the most advanced movement, which I'll get to later, but they do use the level mechanics to a greater extent than the A sides. They show off the creativity the developers had with them perfectly. You wouldn't think at this point there was much more you could do with something like a stoplight platform, but here they are showing you they could. They're fun, challenging, and I get my little heart to show off that I could do it. There's another thing I like to see from platformers, a final level that combines elements of each level in a single gauntlet. Summit has reprisal sections from each level, which is cool but not quite what I'm talking about. The final room in the core's seaside does this. It incorporates the stoplights, space blocks or whatever people call them, clouds, the platforms that move when you dash, these angry guys, and its own mechanics. Now, I don't want to sound super picky or anything, but I really wish it did a bit more here. It sounds entitled because Celeste gives you so much, I just wish they used them a little more than once each. Despite that, this section along with the entirety of the B and C sides were excellent. In fact, there are 2 more important contributions from them. There are a lot of things in Celeste that make me just think, wow. There are a couple of those moments in particular with the B and C sides. You never really expect to learn new movement mechanics late in the game. By this time you'd think you'd learned everything. When you come to the B side of the summit, actually quite close to the end of the level, there will be a jump that, using everything the game has taught you until now, you can't make. Thankfully, our crow friend is here with new instruction telling you that if you dash upward along a wall and press jump, you'll launch off the wall with more distance than if you just jumped regularly. And a side note, the written instruction for this part in the original release was horrible and did not explain how to make this jump work well. I had to look it up and I hate having to look things up. But to their credit, they've fixed the instruction to be clearer. Point being, this is a trick that has never been required for any amount of content yet. Since you aren't supposed to know there are C-sides yet, I could imagine someone saying, they introduced a new mechanic with only a single chapter left in the game? What's the point? In a way, I could see where you're coming from, but I'll address that idea in a bit. An even more impressive instance of this is the beginning of the core's seaside, then used at the very end. You need to use what is called a hyperdash, wherein you dash diagonally forward and down, then jump, and you'll be propelled forward. Just like the jump dash, why would you want to learn a brand new mechanic this late into the game? Surely this goes against my desire to have a game give me a reason to use these mechanics. Well, when you look at what's happening when you do the jump dash or hyperdash, it's really just operating within the established rules of Celeste. That first stoplight causing you to jump into the spikes, dashing works the same way. Jump before your dash is finished and the momentum carries you farther. So, apply that to what you learned in Summit's B-side, the same thing is happening. Dash up, jump off the wall, and your momentum continues. To give what I think is a basic physical explanation for the hyperdash, dashing diagonally adds vertical energy that is converted to horizontal once you're on the ground. Jumping uses both the original horizontal energy and the additional vertical energy to make you go much farther than just doing it horizontally, but you'll receive less height. These are available from the beginning of the game onward, but only if you think about it. Personally, I didn't, but the point is that it's conceivable that someone could discover this on their own. Now, while something like a hyperdash is never required aside from those couple times in the core's seaside, the seasides make great use of the jump dash. Arguably, this isn't especially different from Odyssey's more difficult levels not making full use of the movement, but I would still argue that Celeste uses its various mechanics more creatively than Odyssey did. By the way, yes, I do realize these games are entirely dissimilar outside of being a platformer, but I think the argument is still valid. The other reason I love this is, and this could be said for Odyssey too, that this truly opens the game up. This could arguably only be important for speedrunners and not really anyone else, but they allow anyone to test their skill. I'd suggest watching some videos that got more in depth with these, but I will mention the more important ones for me, though I'm not entirely sure if there's an established terminology, so I'll say what I've seen others say. You've got Super Dash, Hyper Dash, Wave Dash, and Jump Dash. These three can also be done by reversing your left or right direction before jumping, which allows you to use these techniques with less space to move. For example, dashing towards this wall, but right before you jump, you switch the direction you're holding and your momentum will still carry through. The other addition you can make is delaying the jump as much as possible so that your dash actually recharges before the momentum has gone. This means you can hyperdash and retain an extra dash afterwards. Then there are two types of advanced movement that are a bit different. The first is neutral jumping, which is probably the most difficult one to explain. There are two options you have when against a wall. There's hugging, which is just holding towards it, causing you to slowly slide down, and holding, where you grab a wall to not move at the expense of stamina. During either of these, jumping will cause you to kick off the wall. If you do so and then push back towards the wall, you'll end up lower than where you kicked. However, if right before you jump you stop holding or hugging the wall, you'll kick off with the same height, but far less lateral difference. This means if you push back towards the wall, you'll be higher than where you jumped. If you continue to do this, you'll climb the wall. Holding still uses a bit of stamina, hugging uses no stamina at all, which allows you to climb a wall infinitely. The second one is the spike jump. Every time a wall or floor has a spike, the ones at the very end always have an additional pixel beside them which you can still use as a wall or floor. With precision, you can use these spots to jump off of spikes and bypass certain obstacles. While the application of this advanced movement is more important for people interested in speedrunning than anyone else, I think they highlight the level design more than anything. You can do it yourself and try out any of these abilities to see how you can get through the rooms without using the more obviously intended paths. If you don't want to do this yourself, watch a speedrun. The level design is so good, so smart, there are paths seemingly designed for the advanced movement, but you'd never think so if you didn't know. The simple path is always the clearest, but platforms and blocks seem like they're placed meticulously so that both manners of playing can work, meaning less skilled players can play at least the A-sides. This is not an easy feat for a game to have and maintain a decent challenge both ways. In fact, it almost feels like hyperdashing is introduced in the last level and used in the very final obstacle as a way to say, hey, play again and use what you've learned. This is Celeste's greatest achievement. There are actually more than 175 strawberries. Beating the seasides does unlock a couple more new things. Play any level again and you'll find a shiny golden strawberry sitting at the start. Grabbing one of these will keep it locked to you for the entire level where you'll finally collect it. However, if you die, you'll be returned to the beginning. These aren't exactly new content, it's more just a test of consistency. Beat a whole level without dying. To put it into context, I've beaten everything except for all of these, and I did mention I think my death total originally was on the low side, so I'd consider myself good at the game, and I only have 12 out of 24 golden strawberries. Though notice that those 24 only add to 199, surely they wouldn't leave it at 199 strawberries. Well, spoiler, they didn't. It didn't even take someone very long before they discovered the 200th. To get it, you have to beat the Forsaken City without dashing, and that's where neutral jumping and spike jumping come in handy. Jumping off the pixel beside a spike actually gives you a bit more height, which gets you over some hazards you couldn't otherwise. These are relatively easy, at least compared to the spike jumps off of walls. This jump actually gave me a lot of grief, and it's probably the trick I'm least consistent with, but practice makes perfect, as they say. Finally, while neutral jumping isn't absolutely necessary, it can help you continue attempting this part in the event that you miss the jump. Finish this room and you've got your last strawberry, or rather what's considered the 200th, I still have 12 left. Getting those last 25 only adds a golden strawberry stamp to your profile. If you're someone who likes to complete a game fully, this is probably enough for you, otherwise I'm a bit disappointed the epilogue doesn't get affected. Madeline bakes a pie for everyone using the berries she's collected, and there are varying degrees of how much everyone likes it, depending on the amount of berries. The cutoff for the best result is 150, so it would have been nice to see that the 200th gave a secret ending, particularly because the 200th is pretty unique. Either way, I do think the last 25 strawberries are a good inclusion. The second thing you unlock is actually something that was added recently, Variance Mode. This allows you to alter things like a mirrored mode, 360-degree dashing, invisible while moving, no grabbing, etc. You know, in case you're sick and need an additional challenge added to the game. Between the A-sides, strawberries, all the crystal hearts, and the advanced movement, there are many ways to test your skill. The movement feels incredible with a good amount to master, and the magnificent level design keeps it from ever feeling repetitive. I can't think of a platformer I played this much without feeling like I was doing the same thing too much, or even one that has as good movement to begin with, although Odyssey is pretty close. And if you do find Celeste a bit too difficult, it has a set of options to change how the game works called Assist Mode, where you can change the game's speed, stamina, number of dashes, etc. This way you can change the specific thing you're having an issue with without altering the entire game. I'm sure I sound like I'm gushing at this point, but the developer Matt Makes Games seems to have thought about every single thing possible for this game. They even threw in a couple of Easter eggs. In the Golden Ridge, there's a hidden room that had some characters from their previous game Towerfall Ascension, and there's also a Pico 8 version of Celeste found in the resort. It made me wish there were more little secrets like that. As if Celeste couldn't be any more perfect, the music is amazing, and there's a lot of it, including several remix tracks for the B and C sides. My favorite part about the soundtrack is how well the songs capture the emotion of the story. There's a great interview with the composer, Lena Raine, where she talks about her inspiration for a lot of the music. The piano represents Madeline as a character, which makes the song for the Forsaken City a great start. Similarly, Celeste itself is represented by synths. The second chapter has this strange, dark undertone as things start to go wrong, coupled with the dream state that Madeline is in. For music lovers, as Lena explained, the parts with the battle line in this level are actually a minor inversion of Madeline's own theme, which is a clever way of shifting the tone of the music. The progression of the Mirror Temple's music is nothing short of brilliant. The song in the beginning is mysterious, which matches the temple itself and the curiosity that Madeline and Theo have towards it. But what's most notable is once you've entered the mirror, the music becomes extremely discomforting. Turns out it's actually the previous track reversed with a bit of reverb added. It also adds some spoken word, Lena herself saying what she believed Madeline would be thinking in that moment. Of course it's reversed because she's in the mirror world. This is something I didn't notice until I read her interview, which I'll link below, but as Madeline reaches the end, parts of the regular track begin to play over top of the reversed, and together it becomes booming and intense. Specifically in my Crash Bandicoot video, I mentioned that it could have no soundtrack at all and the game wouldn't really change because the music doesn't play a part in the story of the game. This is an instance of that, in case people didn't get what I was saying. The music in this level specifically adds so much to the emotion of the game, and the end becomes a bit overwhelming. I think this helps feel what Madeline might be feeling. Now, if I'm being honest, that point should be obvious. A game without a story isn't going to have music that helps a story like Crash or Sonic. Any game with a story is going to feature a score that shifts with the tone of the story. I'm certainly not profound by saying it. But I'm also not wrong, so I'm going to continue to pretend I'm smart. Other notable parts of the soundtrack are the fight against Madeline, which is one of my favorite tracks, and in the summit, where it actually combines the major and minor themes of Madeline and Badeline now that you're traveling together. The music gets exciting and hopeful as you get higher and higher before it fades out a bit below the peak, leaving you with just the sound of the wind blowing high in the sky, letting you calmly enjoy the view. Just like Madeline, other characters had a theme or instrument tied to them. Theo had a calming guitar, Oshiro had a theremin, which sounds pretty much what I'd expect a ghost to sound like. Little touches like this make the soundtrack feel more alive and tied to the game's world. Please, everyone be alerted, this is an opinion. The best track is Golden Ridge's B-side, which has been playing over this section. Celeste's visuals are lovely, a somewhat retro but modern look with crisp animations and stellar themes. Every level is so distinct and beautiful in their own ways, but I'll repeat myself too much if I talk about every one. Instead, I'll say one thing I really appreciate about the visuals in Celeste. I can already feel people calling me pedantic, but I really like when a platformer creates levels that feel like they would really exist within that universe. I'll use Odyssey again, particularly the Desert Kingdom. This level was fun, sure, but it looked like someone tossed several desert-themed things in various areas and called it a day. There's no cohesion, it doesn't feel like a place that would exist, and I could extend this to several levels in the game. I can see you rolling your eyes, so let me clarify that this does not shatter a game for me. I know Mario is not supposed to come off as a functioning and living world. It is a game in the end. So I'm not saying that games that don't achieve this are lesser, I'm putting emphasis on the games that do uphold some sort of cohesive world design, something that feels like a place beyond a platforming level. Celeste did exactly this. To give another positive example, the Fairy DLC in A Hat in Time is great for this. Lots of platformer quirks, but most of them exist because it's on a ferry. Okay, so what do I mean for Celeste? Think of these platforms that are moving laterally over a gap. They move along a track and background that are still attached to the ledge on the right. Even if this wasn't a platformer, these would still make sense within this world. Keep in mind that I'm not saying that floating platforms are what automatically makes something seem unrealistic for a world. This might seem so extremely minor, so unimportant that I can be sure that some people have turned off the video because of how silly it sounds. I mean, I hope not, but I have a feeling people might care less about this than I do. If you do, then I'm glad. I love this stuff. This sort of attention to detail can help the world building and let me immerse myself in it more so than if it wasn't like this. The team behind soundtrack and visuals should be hugely proud of what they've created. Celeste got the recognition I think it deserved. It's not often an indie game is up for Game of the Year. While it didn't win, it's still a huge honor, and it did win Best Indie of the Year, so I think that's something to be proud of. It was my Game of the Year, but I've yet to play God of War and Red Dead 2. For indies though, without a doubt. It's pretty, difficult, emotional, there's tons of content, and most importantly, it's fun. The story is effective and does a great job drawing parallels from the story to the gameplay and vice versa. It's hard to get to the top, but no matter what task, you always start from the bottom looking up. And remember, whether we're talking about what the story represents or even just the gameplay itself, you can do this. If you've seen my other videos, you'll know this is the part where I mentioned my next video won't have such a long delay. I'm not gonna say that anymore because it's clear I'm a liar. They'll be out when they're out, damn it. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do like hearing me talk about video games, consider joining my Discord so we can talk about them without having to wait an entire year before my next video. Thanks for watching.